Boo! Hey guys, it's just Greg Chapman here. Getting into the Halloween spirit. It's almost Halloween, and I wanted to jump online and read you some of my scary stories. Today I'm going to read from my little mini Halloween collection, The End of Halloween, which is now available on Amazon in print. So the story I'm going to read is Left on October Lane, which is basically a story about a young boy who, in trying to escape some horrible things going on in his home, he ventures out into Halloween night and discovers something even more terrifying. So here we go, Left on October Lane. Jake sat on the end of the bed in his skeleton onesie, listening to a real-life monster screaming at his mum, the horrible sound echoing throughout the house. 20 minutes before, his stepdad John had come home smelling of drink, lumbering beast-like into the kitchen, demanding his steak and beer. Jake had been watching TV, staring at Laurie Strode's terrified gaze when John had walked in. John's stern voice had drawn Jake's gaze to his mother. Laurie Strode's look of fear didn't even compare. Mother and son's eyes met, and when John noticed, he'd stepped between them. "Hey, I'm talking to you," John told Shelley. "I'm sorry," she'd replied, and Jake couldn't help but wish he was holding a knife like Laurie on the TV. John staggered over to stare at Jake and what he was watching. He laughed and shook his head. "What in the name of Christ have you got this kid watching now, Shelley?" Jake averted his stepdad's gaze and watched Michael Myers' pale face dominate the screen. He so wanted to be as strong as Michael. John's voice soared with each vile word that passed his lips. "How can you let a 12-year-old watch that crap, Shelley? You're letting him rot his goddamn mind. Do you know that?" John stormed across the lounge room and switched off the TV with such force that it almost toppled over. "Get your ass in your room, boy," John said. "Please, John, leave him. It's Halloween. He just wants to watch one movie." Jake could tell his mother knew she had made a mistake, and her voice trailed off, but there was no doubt that John had heard her. A wave of fury filled his eyes, more terrifying than any celluloid serial killer. "What did you say to me?" John defied his inebriation to move like a ghost into the kitchen. The following harsh slap of skin on skin that rang out was like a starter's pistol, and it sent Jake out of the lounge room and down the hall so fast that he thought hell was on his heels. As John's tirade had filled the house, Jake had donned his costume and took solace in the mirror, imagining that it was his reflection that was feeling the pain and crying the tears. Those terrible 20 minutes had felt like a lifetime. Jake's tiny heart trapped in a dungeon of fear. All he wanted to do was escape into the street into Halloween. He'd take fake horrors over real ones any day. If only Billy was still home. His big brother was the only one who seemed able to stand up to John. But Billy was long gone, and Jake and Shelley were alone, at the mercy of the monster. Jake looked at his bedroom window. He could sneak out, scale the drain pipe and jump down onto the carpet of leaves below. He'd follow the laughs of happier children all the way to the curb, run away from his fear. And before he could give it a second thought, he did just that. The street was painted in velvet twilight, the day making way for Halloween night. Jake felt the chill air through his costume, and he quickly pulled the hood over his head. He should have grabbed a coat, but it was too late. He wouldn't dare go back into that house now. Without even a look over his shoulder, he ran to the curb and made a sharp left turn towards the sounds of Halloween. The last night of October became more prevalent with each step. Front porches were decorated with candlelit pumpkins, and cardboard ghosts and princesses, aliens and superheroes stood on every corner, seeking out candy. It was as Jake observed the other children that he realised he hadn't grabbed a basket or bag to collect any candy either. But deep down he knew he really wanted to savour the freedom, not knock on the doors of unknown houses. He stopped running and took in the sights and sounds. He knew he was doing the wrong thing, but he didn't care. He couldn't help his mother. She could only help herself. As he observed the darkening street, Jake felt a stab of anger when John's face filled his mind's eye. He'd never hated someone so much before. If only the slob would just go away. If only he'd just drop dead. Jake clenched his fists, the nails digging deep into his palm. If only he was older, he'd killed John himself. Jake stood in the street and took deep, calming breaths. He'd never had such thoughts before. He'd seen people die in movies many times, but could he really commit such an act? Let John come and find him if he dared, but right now it was best that he get as far away from that monster as he could. The night crept in even faster than Jake anticipated. Everything turned to grey, and he could scarcely make out the houses. The street lights only seemed to emphasise the dark rather than combat it. As he walked, the laughter moved further into the distance, and for a moment Jake considered turning back. But even the shadowed streets were safer than home to him. He stopped when he reached a street corner he didn't recognise. The sign read, October Lane. A wispy fog filled the street and made it hard to see anything beyond, but Jake felt compelled to explore this new part of the neighbourhood. Anything's better than going home, he said to himself before moving into the fog. October Lane was a long, straight road flanked by rows of leafless, spindly trees. A full moon struggled to emerge through an ever-shifting veil of cloud, but there was just enough light to reveal the facades of some of the houses around him. Every yard was decorated for Halloween, with gravestones, coffins and spider webs. Some of the houses looked familiar, like Jake had seen them before on TV. One thing they all had in common was that they were devoid of trick-or-treaters of any kind. A low growl stopped Jake dead in his tracks. Amongst the tombstones he glimpsed the silhouette of a large dog peering at him with iridescent eyes. The sight of it sent a chill down into his gut and deeper into his bladder. The boy could suddenly hear every beat of his little heart. Should you be out walking these streets alone, child? Jake gasped as a tall man solidified out of the fog beside him. Swathed in a black robe, he towered over Jake. The boy could discern little from the man's face, apart from his captivating pale eyes. Jake took a step back, the nauseating sense of fear resting in his throat. Hi? Was all Jake could manage. The man's obviously out for Halloween, Jake told himself. Hello, young man. What is your name? The lessons his mother had drummed into him about stranger dangers kicked in. He took another few steps back and almost tripped on the curb. The man slid around him and Jake realised he was surrounded by tombstones, cold stone grave markers. Not foam or cardboard, but actual stone. Your parents are not escorting you? The man asked. His smile was the colour of a fading bruise. Jake looked for escape amongst the tombstones. Leave me alone or I'll call for help. The man smiled wider, revealing pointed teeth. They had to be fake fangs, Jake thought. They had to be. Oh, please do scream, child. Please do. Jake broke into a run, brushing past the man. He felt the weave of his robes, but nothing else, almost as if the man wasn't there. Jake reached the road and followed the dividing line. In the thickening fog, he couldn't get his bearings. He saw house after house, more decrepit than the last. The surrounding trees were claws lashing at his shadow. In one window, Jake saw a large floating eye, its iris flaring with malice. Help, Jake said to the empty street. He looked over his shoulder. He couldn't see the stranger, but that didn't mean he wasn't following him. Jake turned about and ran back the way he thought he'd come. His hot breath mingled with the fog. The miasma was a thick wall of grey, all-encompassing. The houses and trees had been swallowed by it. Help me, please, he cried to no one. Then the fog split, as if two invisible hands were parting a curtain. Beyond, Jake beheld a wide cornfield with thousands of withered plants, and at its centre, a scarecrow crucified. Jake thought his heart was going to stop. The scarecrow craned its Hessian neck, the pointed hat atop its head drooping like a broken limb. I can help you, Jake, it said, before breaking into cackling laughter. The corn plants began to rustle wildly as something within the crop came to life. The plants bent as the unseen thing came closer and closer. The boy screamed. He turned and ran again, but the street was eternal. The houses returned in never-ending rows. Jake felt tears on his face. He wanted his mother so much. He never should have left her. Mum, help me, please. Then the fog faded again, and before him stood Shelley. He could hardly believe it. Mum, I'm here. The thinned cloud only provided a tantalising glimpse, like Jake was looking through tinted glass. He could see Shelley standing on the street corner, back in the real world. She was sobbing for her son, while the trick-or-treating children laughed and cooed with joy, completely oblivious to her plight. None of them knew what lurked on the other side of Halloween. Mum, Jake said. His mother blinked away tears. Her lips were cracked and bloody with John's latest beating. There were finger-shaped bruises around her throat. I'm sorry, Jake, she said, her eyes not seeing her son standing in front of her. Jake reached for her, but the fog was a burning shroud of ice. He recoiled in pain. Mum, see me, please. I'm sorry that I wasn't strong enough, she said. I'm sorry that I wasn't a good enough mother to you and Billy. Jake wanted to tear down the fog wall, to take his mother's hand. No, Mum, I'm here. Why can't you see me? Before his eyes, Shelley began to fade, as if the fog was consuming her, as if she had never been there at all. Jake stared bewildered and terrified that everything he knew and loved was being wrenched away. Even through the fog, he could still make out the movement of the happy children, but his mother was gone. Mum, where did you go? He said. On the other side, another person stepped onto the corner. John. He stood tall, his whole body seething with anger and exertion. John scanned the street with sharp turns of his head. Jake wondered, was he looking for Shelley, or was he looking for him? Jake backed away from the fog, still confused about where his mother was gone, and praying that John couldn't see him. Where the hell are you, you little shit? John said to himself. Jake saw the tension in John's muscles, noticed the scratches on his cheek. There was fear in his eyes, and Jake knew something had happened, something terrible. You better not come home, boy, John said through gritted teeth. Jake remembered the sorrow in his mother's voice before she'd faded away, and the marks on her throat. John had done something to her. John spoke again, but his voice was like the growl of some rabid dog. Because if you do, you'll end up just like your good-for-nothing mother. No! Jake screamed at the wall of fog. No, you bastard! John, oblivious to Jake's presence and preoccupied with the ramifications of his sin, turned his back on the boy and the street corner for good. The man just walked away. The fog closed in and plunged Jake's heart into darkness. He was trapped between monsters. You should never find yourself alone in this place, child. Jake, realizing the horrible truth of his mother's fate, whirled about and lost his footing, toppling to the gritty asphalt. The vampire, the scarecrow, the all-seeing eye and the black wolf loomed in, ravenous and impatient. They were going to devour Jake, soul and all. The boy closed his eyes, waiting for the killing strike, the sting of fangs, the rending of flesh. He was ready for it. All he felt was the cruel touch of a cold night. He opened his eyes and saw his would-be attackers had turned their backs on him. The lidless eye floated up the street, while the wolf slinked back between the tombstones. Only the vampire remained. The creature peered down upon him, not with hunger, but rather pity. "You found yourself lost in this place now, child," the vampire said. Jake saw the others fade into nothing. They'd taken away his desire to die. Why? The vampire started to turn away, exuding only indifference. "Why?" Jake said, urging the vampire to turn back. "Why won't you kill me?" The vampire laughed, its body jerking beneath its cloak. "Oh, child," it said, "you were lost the moment you set foot on this very street." A twinge of fear crept in, but Jake forced himself to his feet. "I wasn't lost. You lured me in here." The vampire shook his head and offered Jake his back once more. His voice trailed off into the fog. "You are lost, child, just like the rest of us. There's nothing here but loneliness, guilt, and eternity." Jake stood alone in the centre of October Lane. His fear morphed into emptiness, like all his veins had been opened. He was hollow and hopelessly worthless. He would have cried if he'd even had tears to shed. He'd lost his mother, his future, and his soul, all on October Lane. That's the end of that story. So feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and stay tuned. I'll read some more stories as we get closer to Halloween. Thanks, everyone.